In this position, pawn to e6, pawn to a6, and pawn to g6 are all available. So you want to play the Slav defense. You want to be solid in your development. If you haven't already done so, get your board and pieces set up in front of you, your pen and pad ready, and take notes. Glad you stopped by. Welcome. Welcome to the Slav defense for newbies. Yo! Yo! Yes, you can transpose to the Slav from different move orders. Here, black supports the d5 pawn with the c6 pawn. And avoids blocking the black bishop with e6. If white decides to capture on d5, black can recapture with an equal position. And after bishop f5, white can just continue development. Knight b4 doesn't work due to queen a4 check. Now I will flip the board because this is from black's perspective. First, we're going to look at organizing and employing fighting forces. I want to set this position. This position highlights the basic ideas for black. d4, and after the move d5, followed by pawn to c4, c6, and most common is the move knight to f3, knight f6, followed by knight c3. From here, black will look for ways to develop his minor pieces. You'll have to be ready for the possibility of white playing c takes d5. And after your recapture, where will you develop your knight on b8? Will you develop the knight to c6 or to d7? After you play bishop f5 followed by pawn to e6, will you place your bishop on b4? Or will you develop your dark square bishop to d6? Maybe you want to consider capturing the pawn on c4. If you do capture the pawn on c4, do you intend to try to hold the pawn or just continue developing your pieces? Final question. Which squares do you want to target? Do you want to target e5? Do you want to target c5? We're going to look at 4 main possibilities for white responses. D takes c4. And now, following, let's look at pawn to e4. It has been said that e4 gives black the opportunity to gain a tempo which allows him time to equalize quickly by giving the pawn back and gaining massive piece activity. And after the move knight to e5, black in this case is able to hold his own. And after the move pawn to e3, black will follow up with pawn from b7 to b5, followed by pawn to b4, with tempo on the knight on c3. After pawn to a4, black has a good follow-up by playing the bishop to f5 with a grip on the e4 square. And we'll follow up with pawn to e6. One possibility after pawn to e.
I have a question. How will black play the bishop to f5 if white's pawn sits on e4? For example, if pawn to e4, then the pawn on e4 stops the bishop from going to f5.
Black will just follow up with pawn to b5 and can now transpose by playing the pawn to e6 since bishop to f5 is not available due to the pawn on e4, or even bishop g4 might be an interesting possibility. So the question to ask is, what's white's idea after playing the rook to b1? The continuation could be rook to b1 and now a6. White's idea here is to pressure both the C file and the B file. So there's a recapture there on B3, and now after pawn to A4, black continues with bishop to E7, rook takes on B3. The knight on B8 is still undeveloped, so black will need to develop the knight because that bishop on B7 will need to be free with the amount of pressure that white mounts up on the C and B files. Therefore, pawn to C5 needs to be played in order to free that bishop, followed by knight on B to D7. And keep in mind that the pawn on E4 is always a target for black, with the bishop on B7 and the knight on F6. So now black targets the pawn on C5, knight on B to D7, which is why pawn from E4 to E5 is played. The knight hops to D5, and in this line, all of the queenside pawns will be eliminated for both sides. Pay attention to how black's pieces are set up. The knight on D7 wants to go to C5, and the bishop needs to drop back to B7 or even A8 if possible. And after knight to C5, knight to E4 if possible. And this is the continuation. Rook over to D1, X-ray and the queen, rook to C8 gaining tempo. Now this is the tempo that black gains in this line. Rook to B8, bishop to D2, bishop to A8. Now the rook is open. Queen over to A1 to get out of the rook's X-ray, and now knight to C5 gains tempo on the rook on B3. And black continues to gain tempo. For example, rook back to B1, knight to E4, bishop drops back to E1, bishop to C5. Black is getting a lot of activity for his pieces. Now this is the tactics that follow. Knight to G5, queen to C4, queen E7. And after knight takes G5, queen takes G5, queen takes C5, knight F4, boom. Bishop to F3 is not available. Pawn to G3, knight regains the piece, knight takes E2 with check. And now we're going to look at the line after knight to E5. D takes C4 and knight to E5. Black can still play the pawn to B5, and after G3, bishop to B7. White plans to pressure the C6 pawn. However, black plays the knight to D5, E4, knight takes C3. The recommended move is knight to D7. And after F4, pawn to E6, bishop E3, bishop to E7, Black will just simply castle, and then the line continues with pawn to a4. It is a good idea for black to capture the knight and then proceed with pawn to b4 in order to challenge white's pawn chain. This tactic does not work for white. Queen to g4 with the plan of threatening checkmate, simply because after bishop to h6, queen takes d4 check, and after the king gets out of check, then queen captures the pawn on e5, and the g7 pawn is defended. Now we're going to look at white's fifth move option, pawn to e3. In this line, after capturing on c4, we're going to play the pawn to b5, and then to b4, white will drop the knight back, and this will open up the bishop on d2. Also, white's bishop on f1 will be open as well after the pawn is captured on c4. So what we want to do as black is to get both of our bishops placed. By the knight being on a2, white places the bishop on d2, pressuring the pawn on b4. Don't sit in pins, get out of the pin. Now the strategy is to push the c-pawn and try to develop the bishop to b7. I encourage you to go to my YouTube page and scroll the videos and look for the video with the title Counterplay versus Space Advantage. And in that video, what I talk about is how you must try to maximize all of your pieces. And after the tension is created in the center, if your pieces are on the critical squares, then that is time when it is time to exchange the pieces. You want to come out better in the exchange. So here there are tactics. So the idea is to release the tension or relieve the tension, the central tension. And this is a number of piece trades. So the knight will go to c6, and now the bishop is pinned, and after b4, knight takes b4, and once again all of the queenside pawns are eliminated. Finally, in this line, black finds a way to trade down to an endgame. Trade a set of rooks, and there's the other trade on d1, and now queen to b1. The queens come off the board. Using this as the starting position from the last line we just examined, white castles. The last move was pawn to a5, but white chose to castle, so we can play the bishop to b7. And now black plays the pawn to a5, supporting the pawn on b4. And the strategy for black here is just to simply finish the development and consolidate in the center. The last variation we're going to examine is pawn to a4 on white's fifth move. Here in this line, black just wants to follow the basic themes, such as getting the light square bishop placed on a good long diagonal, getting a rook on the open C file and possibly to the 7th, consolidating for central control, and in this case, black's queen finds good counterplay on the queen side. Now here, white will exploit his advantage in space. Now, white does definitely have a good advantage in space and stands better, but black, however, is able to hold his own and will continue to defend until white's attack is quenched, and black will demonstrate that. I also recommend my video entitled Keeping Your Eyes Open for Key Moments. Now we're about to go into a very tactical continuation. Bishop takes knight on d4 and black recaptures. This is the exchange sacrifice. And one of my previous videos, I taught you how to exploit the exchange sacrifice. Here, black will demonstrate how to exploit the exchange sacrifice. Notice that the king will be in a pin on the a7 to g1 diagonal. Queen over, and the king gets off the bishop's x-ray, and after capturing pawn on b4, bishop captures the knight on c5. White trades down to an endgame, or I should say a post-middle game endgame, with queen still left on the board. Now, black is going to have to do something creative. Bishop takes e4, and this allows the knight to go to g4, threatening the fork on f2. Now, from here on out, black must find tempo moves. Continue to look for tempo moves, and don't forget that the king is still on the back rank. Queen b8 threatens checkmate on h2, and after g3, now knight to e5 hits the queen on c6. And after the queen moves to defend the bishop, queen to a8 threatens queen takes e4 check. Can black survive this endgame? Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for my next video. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.